Professor Brooke has until recently been a professor of science religion in Oxford, has written very, very widely in the science religion area, contributed an enormous amount in terms of books and conferences, and indeed thinking, which has affected, I think, the thinking of us, many of us here in this room, and so we're grateful to him for his many contributions. And he's going to give us a second part in a series, this two-part series, on a sort of overview, the historical view of science religion. So thank you, John, very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I did say in the previous lecture that I would talk this morning on a rather more specific issue, having discussed the generality earlier. And so I do want to talk this morning about what one might call the spiritual odyssey of Darwin, because I think it raises a whole series of questions which can actually be useful when reflecting on the contemporary debate. But we start not in England, but actually over in the United States at Harvard in 1846, where the great Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz has just arrived, soon to become Harvard's professor of geology and zoology. And according to the records, Agassiz was given, as many speakers are in Harvard, a wonderfully rousing reception. And historians have asked why the university was particularly well disposed to him. And part of the answer seems to be his Platonist philosophy of nature, which struck a chord with the religious ideals of many in the college. And the important point is this, that Agassiz had no time for theories of evolution that involved material connections between species. Rather, in the fossil record, Agassiz saw evidence of progressive creation as one epoch succeeded another. Living things, in other words, were the instantiation of ideas in the mind of a creator. As he once put it himself, there will be no scientific evidence of God's working in nature until naturalists have shown that the whole creation is the expression of thought and not the product of physical agents. Now, Agassiz, as you may have realized, was not alone in that view, because we saw yesterday that in England Richard Owen also ascribed the common bone structures of the vertebrates to an archetypal idea in the mind of God. And I would just like to remind you of that particular image of the archetype, that model, the transcendent model, on which all other vertebrates were based. It's the support for a notion of the unfolding of a divine plan, or what one might call continuous creation. During Agassiz's tenure at Harvard, Darwin published his Origin of Species. And here was a quite different account of the unity of form. For Darwin, it's the consequence of a historical process in which species are related by common descent. And the clash is, of course, transparent, whereas Agassiz proclaimed that the intervention of a creator is displayed in every stage of the history of the world. Darwin's mechanism of natural selection required no such intervention. Agassiz communicated his verdict to Asa Gray, who had been professor of botany at Harvard since 1842. And this is what Agassiz said to Gray: "Mr. Darwin's work is poor, very poor." A few years later, a scientific meeting was held in Boston, at which both Agassiz and the British physicist John Tyndall were present. And Tyndall left a poignant account of a scene that we might say marks the passing of an age. Rising from luncheon, Tyndall recorded, rising from luncheon, we all halted as if by common consent in front of a window and continued a discussion which had been started at table. The maple was in its autumn glory, and the exquisite beauty of the scene outside seemed in my case to interpenetrate the intellectual action. Then, earnestly, almost sadly, Agassiz turned and said to the gentlemen standing round, "I confess that I was not prepared to see Darwin's theory received as it has been by the best intellects of our time. Its success is greater than I could have thought possible." To speak of the passing of an age captures something of the Darwinian impact, but it also misses a vital element, and that's the remarkable diversity of the religious response. Asa Gray, to whom Agassiz confided his poor opinion of Darwin, took a very different view. Gray positively promoted the theory of natural selection. He's one of those Princeton Presbyterians I mentioned earlier. Gray even claims that Darwin's theory has theological advantages. For one thing, it underlines the unity of the human race. The unity of the human race, as we might say, all derived ultimately from a common ancestor. Agassiz's science, incidentally, did not. He was an advocate of polygenism, the view of multiple origins of human races. Gray also argued that Darwin's theory helps the theologians with their most difficult problem, the problem of suffering. Because if competition in a struggle for existence is the motor of evolution, then there is perhaps a sense in which the concomitant suffering is a precondition of the very possibility of our existence. And that's the argument that Gray developed. He even proposed to Darwin himself that the variations on which natural selection worked could be said to be under the control of providence. So I'd like to say a little more just at the outset about the diversity of response to Darwin's theory. Darwin himself, of course, had wondered and worried how his theory might be received. God knows what the public will think, he wrote to one of his correspondents, and I think perhaps God was the only one who really knew. To admit the mutability of species had been like confessing a murder. It's a criminal act in early Victorian society because of the social and political implication. Darwin knew that his book was likely to have a polarizing effect. Perhaps one of the best illustrations of that relates to Oxford rather than to Cambridge, but at a dinner there, Disraeli, the politician, apparently stood up on one occasion and said, "Gentlemen, it seems that we're either on the side of the apes or on the side of the angels. As for me, I am with the angels." And next day, the national press produced the perfect response. Notice the dichotomy again, though, either with the apes or with the angels, and the middle ground somehow falls away. Our anecdotes exclude the middle positions. Now, the threat to human dignity that so worried Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, was often captured in the cartoons of the period. This is one of my favourite ones, actually, where one monkey says to the other, "Cut my tail off quick, Tim. I can't wait to take my true place in society." Bruising attacks from members of the clergy made Darwin say, or almost say, that those who oppose my theory by snarling and baring their teeth only confirm thereby their canine origin. He almost said that. At a deeper level, the responses of 3 women reveal other problems and other layers of diversity. Darwin's wife, Emma, admitted late in life that some of his writing had been painful to her, particularly the view that the moral sense had been the product of evolution. That's one very common view and articulated by Darwin's own wife. An elderly Mary Somerville, actually not looking so elderly there, observed with nostalgic regret that the beauty of a bird's plumage and its song were no longer designed for our delight. It was their utility to the birds themselves that mattered now. A recasting of the concept of utility, and one would have to say design. For a feminist leader, and this is my third example, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Darwinism offered the bright prospect of emancipation. The real difficulty in woman's case, she wrote, is that the whole foundation of Christian religion rests on her temptation and man's fall. If, however, we accept the Darwinian theory, she continues, that the race has been a gradual growth from the lower to a higher form of life, and the story of the fall is a myth, we can exonerate the snake, emancipate the woman, and reconstruct a more rational religion for the 19th century. Now, there was an even greater variety of reaction. If our question were Darwin and God, where and when, we would discover, as I was intimating last night, that geographical parameters have played a key role in shaping receptivity to Darwinian ideas. As David Livingstone has shown, Presbyterians in Princeton reacted very differently from those in Northern Ireland, and differently again from those in Scotland. And I just realised we could all have a research programme this very morning, because supporting the projector are 4 volumes of the Presbyterian for around the year 1900. So we ought to go and look at this and look up the word Darwin in the index, and then I shall have my talk for next time. On the question of race, the reception of Darwin's theory in New Zealand was very different from perceptions in the southern states of America. We can go into that, if you like, in discussion. But in New Zealand, the Darwinian theory was used to justify the extinction and persecution of the Maori by colonial invaders. In this country, we've never had the monkey trials and the high-profile court cases that have been part of the story in the United States. In fact, in England, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, and that's not him, that's John Tyndall. In England, a future Archbishop of Canterbury, Frederick Temple, was already speaking in favour of evolution and against a God of the gaps as early as 1860, within months of Darwin having published. Such contrasts, I think, suggest that we do need to draw a distinction between religious responses shaped by a popular understanding of what is meant by the word God, and more sophisticated responses informed by serious theology. And that distinction was made at the time. It was made by Francis Ellingwood Abbott, a liberal clergyman, and one of Darwin's correspondents. So here's Abbott to Darwin, 20th of August, 1871. If I rightly understand your great theory of the origin of species, it contains nothing inconsistent with the most deep and tender religious feeling. It certainly conflicts with the popular notion of God, but it seems to me to harmonise thoroughly with the enlightened ideas concerning him, held by all highly cultured minds of today. And for one, I feel that you've done a vast service to true religion by your labours. And by the close of the 19th century, that was not such an uncommon view. I mentioned last night the reaction of Aubrey Moore, the Oxford theologian, who declared that under the guise of a foe, Darwin had done the work of a friend, protecting Christianity from that deistic travesty in which God was active only when interfering in the natural order. So it should be clear by now that I don't want to structure this talk around science versus religion in any straightforward sense. In some ways and in some places, the debate really is more polarized now than it was during the 19th century. Contrary to modern creationist rhetoric, Darwin was never an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God, and he actually says that himself. Darwin continued to refer to a creator who in his own words created through laws. It's a very interesting phrase, that. A creator who creates through laws. And because Darwin himself anticipated some of the more sophisticated theological moves, I'm going to devote the remainder of this talk to his reflections on religion and some of their contemporary significance. But there are a few preliminary problems, and I think it's only reasonable we should air these. Whenever we ask about the religious beliefs of scientists from the past, there's no simple answer. And there's no simple answer to the question, what did Darwin believe about God? There are several reasons for this. Primarily, his views changed over time. As many of you will know, he came to Cambridge here after an abortive training in medicine in Edinburgh. He came to Cambridge to study to become a Christian minister. And he later wrote in life that it seemed incredible to him in retrospect that he was once training to be a priest, given the irascible reactions to his theory from so many of the clergy. But he had once trained to be a Christian priest. At the time he wrote The Origin of Species, I think deistic would be the best kind of description. In other words, he believed in a creator who had laid down the laws that the universe would follow, but he did not believe in the authenticity of any special revelation. And late in life, he described himself as increasingly agnostic. So one always has to take into account this dynamic shift. And again, it's a complication when trying to establish any kind of normative account of what it is or is not appropriate to believe. Because even during one and the same period, Darwin admitted that his beliefs often fluctuated. When he refers to himself as an agnostic in May 1879, he adds the caveat, but not always. It's as if on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, theism still surfaces, but Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays the feeling goes away again. At other times, he wrote that I suppose I deserve to be called a theist. Again, indicating very strongly, I think, that he was not of an atheist frame of mind. And I just stress this because there's a lot of disparaging literature which wishes to assimilate the Darwinian theory to satanic contrivance. And I wouldn't wish us to make the mistake of thinking that Darwin was the atheist he's often portrayed to be in that genre of literature. What I'm saying here is that if we try to compress a complicated matter simply into sound bites, we shall get it wrong. Darwin sometimes said that he couldn't believe that this wonderful universe can be the result of chance alone. And such remarks have lent themselves, of course, to apologetic exploitation. But I think to appropriate them in that way misses a nuance that Darwin so often inserted. And by the end of this lecture, you should have a little collection of Darwinian nuances, because they do reveal a very astute and very honest thinker. I cannot believe that this wonderful universe is the result of chance. But he adds, but nor can I believe that the structures of living organisms are the product of design. As he disarmingly wrote to Asa Gray, "I am in a hopeless muddle," or on another occasion, "I am in thick mud." He was somehow living between two worlds and finding it quite difficult to articulate a vocabulary that would do justice to the subtlety of his own theory. And while we're just dealing with preliminary problems, there's the complication that stems from the privacy of religious belief. Because Darwin once reproached an inquirer by saying, "I cannot see why my religious beliefs should be of concern to anyone but myself." And his public remarks were sometimes deliberately calculated to give minimal offence. In contrast to some of his modern disciples, Darwin did not believe that religious beliefs, however distasteful, should be confronted head-on. That is not the way to call them into question. But because of that, there is a frustrating degree of ambiguity in Darwin's own references to the deity. And we do have to take that into account. But I'd like to say something now about the formative experiences, particularly those which led to his metaphysical outlook. The story of how Darwin's science was shaped by his experiences on the 5-year voyage of HMS Beagle has been told many times, and brilliantly. There's a wonderful biography of Darwin by Janet Brown in 2 volumes. There's a wonderful biography of Darwin by James Moore and Adrian Desmond. And I just strongly recommend those to you. They're 2 of the very finest books that have appeared of the scientific biography genre, certainly during my career. What I would like to do, instead of just trying to repeat those excellent accounts, is just to pick out 3 encounters that also left a permanent mark on Darwin's religious outlook. And the first encounter we might call the encounter with the beauty of a virginal nature. Darwin had been entranced by images of the South American rainforest. Particularly, he'd been impressed by the writings of the German explorer Alexander von Humboldt. And to a young man of romantic sensibility, when Darwin finally arrived in the jungle, a scene like that conjures up a response, which is almost that of a kind of surrogate religion. It's during the voyage of the Beagle that Darwin gradually gave up the idea of becoming a clergyman. And I think you can hear the stirrings of that surrogate religion in the notes he makes when confronting a scene like that, because he records the experience in almost ecstatic language. "Twiners entwining twiners," he wrote, "tresses like hair, beautiful Lepidoptera, silence, Hosanna." It's a very, very interesting graduation of language. So Darwin on the voyage gradually gives up the idea of becoming a clergyman. No great religious crisis, I think that's very clear, but one just feels that the study of nature itself is exercising a seductive spell. A second encounter is this. To encounter nature in the raw was to encounter a struggle for existence that played such a crucial role in his theory of natural selection. Because the world Darwin encountered in South America was not the happy world that William Paley had supposed in his natural theology. Just a reminder again of that happy world in which creatures had been beautifully adapted for their particular way of life. And one has to say that Paley's argument for design is very easily caricatured. He wrote somewhere that the human epiglottis is so wonderfully designed that no alderman has ever choked at a feast. Well, you could say that, I suppose. On the other hand, you might not. During the South American voyage, Darwin did encounter nature in the raw. And I like to show you that slide because it captures the image of those giant condors feeding on young cattle, one of the largest birds of prey in the world. This is nature red in tooth and claw, but writ large, one might say. But it's not only that kind of struggle that Darwin encounters on the voyage. He encounters the struggle between human societies. This actually is very important. There's a long tradition of Marxist historiography which suggests Darwin simply projected capitalist competition onto nature. But in fact, it's colonial competition that actually makes the biggest impression upon him, particularly during the voyage. This is an image of General Rosas, who was leading Christian soldiers against the native Indians. And I think one has to say that many of Darwin's sympathies were with the indigenous people. So there's that kind of struggle. But there's another too, reflecting an instability in the natural order. And Darwin encountered that when he arrived at the city of Concepcion, because he experiences an earthquake, or certainly the immediate aftermath of an earthquake. And that is the cathedral of Concepcion, but in ruins. And some might even see in that a kind of symbol of a story that we're telling. This isn't just anecdotal, because Darwin wrote home at that very moment, reflecting on the fact that if England in its history had been beset with volcanoes and earthquakes, as other parts of the globe have been, then perhaps William Paley's Happy World would not have taken on quite such a strong resonance. A world in which there are volcanoes, earthquakes, natural disasters, is a world that doesn't quite lend itself to the notion, perhaps, that it's the best of all possible worlds. But there's another kind of struggle too, on which I need to say a little more. The Beagle eventually got to the southern tip of South America, the Tierra del Fuego, one of the most inhospitable regions of the globe. And there he encountered the native Fuegians, who were eking out a meager existence, struggling against this wretched environment. And this encounter with the Fuegians does, I think, deserve special consideration, because Darwin would eventually ask, were our ancestors men like these? Certainly not your typical Cambridge undergraduate. Darwin's, or perhaps they are. There are one or two like that, Darwin's interest in these Fuegians stemmed in part from an interesting evangelical experiment that was taking place. Because on a previous trip to this part of the world, Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, had actually captured some of these people, taken them back home to England, educated them as far as it was possible, converted them to Christianity, dressed them up in their Sunday best, and the idea was to take them back to their own people as missionaries. And this experiment is taking place, and Darwin is very interested to observe what happens. He was also full of some trepidation, because one or two of the Fuegians on board ship told him that he'd have to be very careful if he went on land, because the Fuegians were actually cannibals. And that the men preferred to eat their wives than to eat their dogs, because the dogs were actually useful. I apologise for that. Well, I think it was possibly a joke at the time, but not everybody saw it. Now, these are the Fuegians who were on board ship, and you can see there is rather a contrast between those dandified beings and the image you've just had on the screen. Incidentally, that rather stern-looking fellow at the bottom had been christened, literally, York Minster. And, well, I could give you the names of the others, but it's not really important. Now, what happened, actually, was that this experiment, one has to say, was a disaster. The missionary who was accompanying these people eventually had to flee, and when the Beagle returned, some weeks after they had first been landed back with their own people, it was clear that the educated, the Christianized Fuegians had reverted to time. And I think that raises two questions in Darwin's mind. One concerns what we might call the rather thin veneer of civilization, how easy it is to strip from all of us, perhaps, those excrescences from our culture, which then lay bare the animal underneath. But more crucially, actually, for Darwin's religious reflection, is that as he observed these people, he recognized the failure of a criterion that had been put forward by his cousin, Hedley Brooke, who had said that it is possible to distinguish decisively between human beings and other animals. And Hedley Brooke had told him that the difference consists in this, that only human beings have an innate sense of God. Darwin had been very struck by it and makes a note of it. But he also comments, having seen the Fuegians and having visited Australia later, how little this is in evidence, he writes, in a Fuegian or an Australian. Well, you know what I mean. Darwin returned to that formative experience when he wrote about religion in his book, The Descent of Man. That failure of Hedley Wedgwood's criterion left a permanent mark on his thinking. And of course, he's going to stress the continuity between the other primates and the human species. Well, I want to gradually move now towards the articulation of a theological question. And it arises perfectly naturally, in fact, out of the theory that Darwin was to formulate. Because his study of variation and his conception of natural selection were products of the 2 years that followed his return to England. The key years for the formulation of the theory are between 1836 and 1838. And here we have a rather remarkable coincidence, because as with Alfred Russel Wallace later, it was the reading of Malthus's essay on population which triggered the realization in Darwin that in a fiercely competitive struggle, favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones destroyed. Darwin's use of the phrase natural selection raises immediately a theological question, because that metaphor of selection is substantiated in Darwin by reference to the role of human breeders in selecting for the characteristics they wish to enhance in cattle or in dogs or even in pigeons. Darwin spent a lot of time with pigeon fanciers, and I think they also rather fancied this because it gave him some, or rather gave them, a little extra status if a distinguished naturalist was interested in their work. But he's interested in it for a very special reason, because if domestic breeders can effect such changes in a relatively short span of time, how much more might not nature achieve given immense periods of time? Pigeons have an important place in Darwin's Origin of Species because they provide some of the rhetoric on which the argument hangs. And Darwin says, and we're thinking here of images of this kind, Unless one knew that all the varieties you see there are produced by or from the common rock pigeon, even a well-trained ornithologist would be inclined to categorize them as separate species. Even a well-trained ornithologist would be tempted to see those as different species of birds, and yet we know they're all derived from a common ancestor. And that's the analogy, that's where the word selection actually gets its bearings from in Darwin's metaphorical use. But there is then the theological question, because if human intelligence intervenes in the practices of the domestic breeder, might there not, by analogy, be a selector with a capital S working through natural processes? And for some of Darwin's contemporaries, this seemed a reasonable enough inference, and for them, and it's an important point, it took the sting out of the theory. But we have to be clear here, this is not Darwin's own view. To postulate a divine selector, other than the course of nature, was simply to miss the point as far as he was concerned, because it conjured up the image of God as a kind of micromanager of the evolutionary process. And that image is one that Darwin steadfastly resisted. So there's an interesting historical question as to why Darwin was resistant to the interpretation that many of his contemporaries were perfectly willing to place on the theory. It seems to me pretty obvious that his resistance does have something to do with the loss of his Christian faith. And that immediately raises the further question. What precisely was the relationship between the gains he made in science and his loss of faith? It's interesting at this point because I think in much of the Darwinian literature you find one of two extreme positions. One extreme position is that it was his science that destroyed his faith. The other extreme position is that it was his loss of faith that made possible his radical science. And E.O. Wilson at Harvard is one recent commentator who has presented the choice in those rather stark terms. Notice again, we are with a kind of dichotomy, a duality, as if there might not be some kind of intermediate position. This is E.O. Wilson, the great naturalist, note the reverence. The great naturalist did not abandon Abrahamic and other religious dogmas because of his evolution by natural selection, as one might reasonably suppose. The reverse occurred. The shedding of blind faith gave him the intellectual fearlessness to explore human evolution wherever logic and evidence took him. Well, there's a bit of hagiography in that, I think. But are these the only alternatives? And my own view certainly is that a more subtle analysis is necessary. While it is largely true that Darwin's loss of faith was not occasioned by his science, there were at the very least some indirect connections. Even before his marriage to Emma, she worried, and she expressed this in a very, very interesting and penetrating letter. She worried that the critical, skeptical mentality necessary for a life in science would conceivably corrode his faith. And she's genuinely worried about it. The second opinion, that preferred by Professor Wilson, cannot, I think, be entirely correct, because Darwin was apparently still a Christian in the early 1840s, when the first substantial draft of his theory was entrusted to Emma for publication in the event of his death. In other words, the theory is in place, and he is still thinking in Christian terms. that entrusting of the manuscript to Emma in the event of his death just deserves a little footnote, because Darwin seems to have been convinced he was going to die all the time, or at least once, but probably soon. And I think it's very interesting that he felt he had already got something that was of great value, which he wanted to ensure would be published, even in the event of some personal catastrophe. Another problem with this structuring of alternatives, is it the science that destroys the faith, or the faith that makes the science possible? Another problem with it is that some of Darwin's deepest reflections involved both scientific and religious considerations simultaneously. And as an example, his science highlighted the theological problem of pain and suffering. He once wrote, "The existence of so much pain and suffering in the world seems to me one of the strongest arguments against belief in a beneficent deity. But," and he immediately continues this in the same sentence, "it accords well with my theory of natural selection." So the scientific consideration and the religious reflection are fused together in that one sentence. So we need to look a little more closely at Darwin's loss of faith. And I want to suggest, first of all, that his science did, to a degree, corrode the Christianity that he was earlier going to preach. And it did so, I think, for the following reasons. Firstly, the quality of the historical evidence commonly adduced for the miracles and divinity of Christ, Darwin eventually considered to be poor evidence, compared with the stringent evidential support required of a scientific theory. That's the first consideration. Secondly, reports of miracles had been rendered increasingly suspect because of advances in scientific understanding, to which he was himself contributing. As he put it in his autobiography, "The more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become." Thirdly, although he was ignorant of the causes of variation, Darwin was convinced that their appearance was random. Many variations seemed to be disadvantageous, and those that turned out to be favourable could hardly be said to have been produced with their prospective use in mind. And it's on that point that Darwin and Asa Gray, whom I mentioned earlier, parted company. Gray's advice to Darwin is that until such time as the cause of variation is understood, it would be wise to ascribe it to providence. And that's one reason why Gray felt no contradiction between natural selection and natural theology. He could interpret the variations as having been led by God in propitious directions. But Darwin dissented from that view, arguing that because a builder happens to use a pile of available stones to build a house, it in no ways follows that the stones had come into being and to be in that place in order that the builder could build that house. Purposiveness, in other words, was read out of the story, and Gray had to concede that he had no answer to that particular analogy, that particular objection. No answer, except to say, and I think there is a lesson here for some, except to say that the perception of design is ultimately a matter of faith. The perception of design is ultimately a matter of faith. And that recognition, I think, is an important moment in the history of natural theology. Darwin's science did contribute to his agnosticism, and I think for one further reason and in one further respect. I've already referred to his conviction that the universe as a whole could not be the product of chance. But in another of his captivating nuances, Darwin added that there were reasons why he should not trust even his own conviction. Why should we not trust our own convictions? Well, he says, if the human mind is the product of evolution and reflects its survival value, what guarantees are that the human mind is equipped to deal with the kind of metaphysical and theological niceties that usually crop up in weekend courses on science and religion? Having identified these corrosive aspects of his science, I would still want to say, I think, that some of the most interesting reasons for Darwin's agnosticism have nothing to do with his theory, and indeed could have been shared and were shared by many of his contemporaries. And to that extent, I agree with E.O. Wilson's end of the spectrum. Because there were, I think, existential grounds of religious doubt, and primarily among them was a moral revolt by Darwin against a very specific Christian doctrine. And it's the doctrine of eternal damnation for those who are not of the elect. And Darwin describes this as a damnable doctrine. And indeed, the strongest words he ever uses to attack Christianity are in that particular context, where he does say, I cannot see how anybody could even wish Christianity to be true. Now, his wife was deeply upset by that and thought that Charles was actually offering a kind of caricature of how doctrines of eternal felicity or eternal damnation were usually preached. But I think it's a very poignant matter for Darwin himself, and for a very specific reason. He belonged to a dissenting family. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had actually been an evolutionist, was also a free thinker. Darwin's father was a free thinker who made very rude remarks to the effect that religion is just made for women. If Darwin's own father is going to go to hell because he doesn't subscribe to the faith, then that's also true of Darwin's brother Erasmus, who was part of an atheist circle of free thinkers that met regularly in London. So this question of the future state of members of his own family is a very poignant and a very personal matter for Darwin. We've also seen that he was affected by the realization that an innate sense of God was not universal. I should incidentally just show you my slide of Darwin's father, who was the greatest man I ever saw. That is in bulk rather than reputation, as you can see from the slide. It was when his father was dying in the late 1840s that I think Darwin was forced to confront again this particular issue of the future life of those who leave this earth. But as he experienced and studied other cultures, Darwin found it impossible to accept the idea that there had been some unique revelation from a deity. And he claims that the scriptural writers had an ignorance which was transparent to him. He also found the relationship of the New Testament to the Old Testament somewhat incongruous. So there are issues concerned with the defense of revelation that play a very key role in his thinking. As Jim Moore has brilliantly shown, Darwin was also deeply affected by the death, early in 1851, of his 10-year-old daughter, Annie. And the letters that passed between Charles and Emma, his wife, as Annie gradually lost her private struggle for existence, are deeply moving. Even as late as 1851, in distress because of Annie's illness and under duress, Darwin still invoked the name of God in his most intimate correspondence. But the loss of so innocent a child, who was actually his favourite, left a terrible scar. Was this not the problem of pain and suffering, justice even, writ large? I should say that the correspondence that passed between Darwin and Emma you can read in the Darwin correspondence volume that deals with the year 1851. And I would defy you to read that correspondence and not to burst into tears. It's actually one of the most pathetic correspondence that I have ever read. It's deeply, deeply touching. As Jim Moore puts it wonderfully, the death of Annie amounted to the crucifixion of Darwin's hopes. There's one last consideration I think that is important, and it comes out in one of Darwin's letters to Asa Gray. It's not a scientific consideration at all, as you will very quickly see. This is the question that Darwin puts to Gray. If a man stands under a tree and is struck by lightning and dies, do you believe that it was intended, that it was designed, that that particular man should be struck by that particular lightning bolt at that particular time? Now I know, says Darwin, many do believe that, but I can't. And I do really want to know what you believe, he says to Gray. I'm serious about it. Or if a swallow swallows a gnat on a summer evening, perhaps in Paley's happy vicarage garden, do you really believe that it was designed that that particular swallow should swallow that particular gnat at that particular moment? I do not, says Darwin. In other words, he's a high sensitivity to the particularities, the contingencies, the accidents of both human and non-human life, the absence, we might say, of any intelligible pattern. And it's this, for him, that makes belief in providence extremely difficult, if not impossible. Well, as you saw, I gave this morning's lecture the title Darwin and God Now and Then. And I'd just like to say in conclusion a few words about the now. Because much has, of course, changed in the 150 years since the period we've been discussing. I doubt, for example, that a latter-day Agassi arriving in Harvard now would be quite as welcome to Harvard scientists if he were to defend explicitly a Christian Platonism. But if we can accept E.O. Wilson's assertion that there is a timeless quality and inspiration in Darwin's science, then I think symmetrically one might say there can still be a timelessness about a refined religious sensibility and even a traditional theological argument. The claim that God is able to cause causes to be causes is still made today as it might have been in Darwin's own time. I'm thinking there, of course, particularly of Thomist philosophers who like to talk about causality and the distinction between primary and secondary causality. Without wishing to minimize the many problems that Darwin's science has raised for religious orthodoxies, I think it is still possible for religious thinkers to look to Darwin himself, both for inspiration and also, I think, for guidance, in a sense, about how to conduct oneself in intellectual combat. For example, Darwin anticipated the development of theodicies based on evolutionary motifs. If species have all been separately created, then the deity must surely bear direct responsibility for those that may appear to us, as they did to Darwin, to be rather devilish. I'm thinking of that wasp, or the ichneumon, that lays its eggs in the body of a caterpillar. And when the eggs hatch, the grubs just devour the host. What horribly cruel wasteful works of nature, Darwin writes, when he reflects on that particular example. But if these creatures that we find devilish had not been separately created, if they were simply possibilities in a process that also made human beings possible, then that might indicate some attenuation, some dilution, one might say, of divine responsibility. And it's interesting that in the earliest drafts of his theory, Darwin certainly thought so. That argument is present. It's almost as if his science of evolution would exonerate the deity for the appearance of what he called a long succession of vile molluscous animals. They are possibilities in a universe in which it is also possible for human beings to emerge. They are, if you like, the debit side of the account. Well, not everybody would want to look at it that way, but certainly the possibility of that kind of theodicy was developed by Darwin himself. And that distancing of God from the direct determination of natural phenomena has found its place both in process theologies and in theologies which stress God's self-limitation in allowing nature its relative autonomy. Those developments, of course, occurred in the years separating Darwin from ourselves, but they do, I think, open doors for conciliation that he himself had glimpsed. Well, what inspiration might religious thinkers find in the real as distinct from the caricatured Darwin? I think we might all learn something from Darwin's humility. In matters concerning discourse about God, there were for him no simple answers. On ultimate questions about intentionality and purpose in evolutionary processes, Darwin preferred humility to arrogance, saving his severest censure for those who believed they could reason their way from nature to God. Humility is an important virtue for Darwin. We might learn also from his honesty, the honesty he displayed when admitting the difficulties that his theory faced. There are wonderful chapters right in the middle of The Origin of Species where he identifies what the objections to his theory might be, indeed will be. And it's a brilliant rhetorical as well as an honest device, because he very cleverly shows that each of those objections, however forceful it might appear, can actually be resolved through the application of natural selection. And that honesty and that clever admission of the difficulties contrasts sharply with what I have many times seen as dishonesty in many of his detractors, who seize on any kind of internecine dispute within evolutionary biology as evidence of a theory that is somehow in disarray. I'd also like to say, and this is almost addressed perhaps more to the scientists, there is something to learn from Darwin's sensitivity to the limitations of his science. He knew perfectly well that there are limit questions, and never pretended to explain the origins of the universe, or even the origins of life. Darwin was neither a dogmatic materialist, nor even a dogmatic naturalist, as John Tyndall recognized when reproaching him for his restraint. Darwin was even willing to use biblical language when speaking of the life breathed in to the first few living forms. He sometimes said he regretted it, but he only says that when he's writing to people less sympathetic to religion than himself. There is a kind of openness in Darwin's agnosticism that is certainly missing in some of his modern disciples. At the same time, again, I think, we have to respect his wisdom in sidestepping the plea from Asa Gray that he should acknowledge the direct hand of God in guiding variations in predetermined direction. Because once the origin of variation did become explicable through genetic mutation, Darwin was surely vindicated. It's a little vignette, if you like, in the history of the God of the gaps. Gray suggesting God should be invoked when scientific explanation simply came up against its current, but not its final, limits. This means, of course, that Darwin would have something to say to proponents of intelligent design in its recent manifestations. Darwin was fully aware that the elements of complex systems could be assembled into functioning wholes by long historical processes. He was fully aware that this might involve the co-opting of parts that had once served other purposes. But more than that, Darwin recognized the theological damage that can be done by conflating different kinds of causality. In a recent essay, the Catholic philosopher and theologian William Carroll has written the following. To explain the development of complex biological structures by an appeal to causes other than those in the natural order would suggest that God could not have created a natural order endowed with causal principles adequate to produce the changes in that order. Interestingly, and perhaps to some surprisingly, Bill Carroll would have an ally in Darwin himself, because Darwin once wrote, to suggest that the deity is unable to effect its purposes through natural causes would be an act of profanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Well, I'm sure that's stimulated plenty of questions and thoughts and discussion. And I guess we should start perhaps with Darwin. It can broaden out if you want to, but it might be helpful to the first part of the question time anyway if we focus somewhat on Darwin himself and particularly what we've just been hearing. So anyone want to kick off the first question today?
Since you like third ways, and you presented a dichotomy that you didn't like, I wanted to suggest another possible one to see how it works for you. On the question of whether science made it loses faith or the loss of faith made the science possible, could you posit a third way that said that Darwin never had a genuine Christian faith, and what he lost was a veneer of Christian faith, also known as civilization or Victorian sensibility, and just as those clothes of Fuegians could be removed and they could revert to their naked state, so also for Darwin, what he lost was this sort of just culture of Christianity, not any true religion.
That's a very important question, and it's a line of interpretation which some have certainly followed, not least, of course, because when he came to Cambridge to prepare for a career in the ministry, it was to some degree at his father's rather oppressive request, simply that if he was not to be a doctor and if he didn't wish to study law, to become a clergyman was one way of actually achieving some kind of social status. So that line of interpretation does have a degree of plausibility, and the very fact that he doesn't experience some kind of religious crisis and freely acknowledges this himself would possibly also give some weight to that interpretation. On the other side, I think one does have to read what Darwin says during his time here in Cambridge, when he is reading theological works and preparing for his examinations, as well as collecting beetles, which was the great diversion that he so greatly enjoyed. And when you read that literature, you feel you're dealing with somebody who has got genuine concerns about the depth of his faith, genuine anxieties. He talks about these. But it is within a basic framework of belief, I think. I do honestly believe that that particular point you've raised is one we shall never satisfactorily answer, because it's so difficult, isn't it, to get inside the head of somebody who may be experiencing doubts of various kinds. But we shouldn't forget that he's mixing here in Cambridge with very devout clergy who do see nature as the temple of God. And so that ethos, that way, that mindset, one might almost say, is very much part of his life during the Cambridge years. In marked contrast, one has to say, to the rather spirited life, one might say, he experienced in Edinburgh, where medical students famously let their hair down a little.
I think it's interesting also, isn't it, how in Darwin's autobiography he reflects that the only thing that was any use to him here was actually reading Paley in terms of his own educational formation. I don't know if you want to comment on that and how that might have impacted on his later theories.
Yes, that's a deeply interesting question, not least because I think as a consequence of certain views one finds among popular writers, there is in a lot of people's minds this very clear contradiction between Darwin's view of nature and that of Paley. And I've said enough to explain how that could arise. But Paley is one of the authors that Darwin quotes most. And I think there are at least two respects in which Darwin is deeply in debt to Paley. One is for focusing on the very question of adaptation and how it should be explained. Darwin never denies that living structures are brilliantly adapted, not necessarily perfectly, adapted to their particular needs. So the focus on adaptation, which is so strong in Paley, is a legacy from that natural theology. But there's a much more subtle way in which Darwin was in debt to Paley, though it is a debt which, by his own admission, was also a constraint. If you look at The Descent of Man, you will see that by 1871, when Darwin published that book, he had retreated somewhat from the strong emphasis he placed on natural selection in the first edition of The Origin of Species. There are 6 editions of The Origin, and they do very gradually change as Darwin had to deal with objection. In The Descent of Man, Darwin says it was once my belief that every detail of structure had to have some use or purpose. Now there's a sense in which it does have to if you are advocating the potency of natural selection, because if the structure doesn't do anything, why should it be there and why should it be preserved? But notice that presupposition that every detail of structure does have some use is precisely the presupposition that informed William Paley's natural theology. So there is a very interesting continuity and a reinterpretation of Paley, perhaps, rather than a destruction. And if I may just add one further point there, Paley is a much more sophisticated writer in certain respects than he's given credit for. And although that argument from contrivance to contriver, which I referred to last night, though that argument is central to his whole book, he also wants to argue very firmly that there is evidence for design in the laws of nature. And so when Darwin speaks of a creator creating through laws, he's also using a vocabulary that Paley was perfectly willing to countenance. So we have the very interesting phenomenon that Darwin undermined, we might say, one version of the design argument, but certainly left wide open the question of whether the laws of nature were themselves design. And when you press him on that particular point, he says, I am apt to see living structures as the result of design laws, but with the details left to chance. So that notion of design is still there in Darwin's writings, and it is very similar to that which we find in Paley. So we mustn't be deceived by the fact that there is a blind watchmaker let loose by Richard Dawkins.
Yes.
What struck me, you mentioned in context with the Fuegans that I think it's cousins that evidence of God is to be found only in human beings, which seems to be sort of a concept of Descartes. Later on, you mentioned that Darwin was talking about the limitations of the human mind within evolution, which would perhaps not enable us to fully appreciate the metaphysics discussed in a context like this, which really accords to quite modern theories of philosophy of mind. Is that sort of a development or does it reflect the development in Darwin's philosophical views? Did he express them in those terms as well? Or was his struggle with theology or with philosophy as well, on philosophy from the dualism of Descartes to the monism of perhaps more modern views?
As early as what we call the Transmutation notebooks between 1836 and 1838, he is already addressing the question of mental processes and whether they are grounded in the material processes of the brain. And so one could say that his thinking about mental processes is already shaped, particularly by philosophical literature on the workings of the mind. But it's not an either-or. You said, is he struggling with theological issues, or is it a philosophical legacy he's working with? The answer is it's both, simply because the first, I think I'm right in saying this, the first person to articulate the proposition that it is the brain that thinks was Joseph Priestley, a Unitarian minister of the 18th century, who's both a religious dissenter and, at the same time, a monistic philosopher when it comes to the workings of the mind. Now, that Unitarian position that Priestley developed would have been well known within the Darwin family because of the dissenting tradition that I referred to earlier. So when Darwin, even in the late 1830s, is thinking about the workings of the mind, I think it's fair to say that he is already drawn to a monistic position. In fact, there is a notebook entry where he says, "Oh, you materialist!" exclamation mark, exclamation. It's almost as if he feels that he's been brought to some kind of precipice which he hadn't initially recognized. So if we're talking about philosophy of mind, I think one would have to say that he was a monist rather than a dualist, but that itself could be grounded in a theological, albeit a dissenting theological tradition. As for the qualification about whether we can actually know anything about God by intuition or introspection, the fact that he deviated from Hensley Wedgwood's position, having observed the Fuegians and the Australians, suggests to me that quite early in the articulation of the theory, some of those doubts might have surfaced. But I think it's probably only during his agnostic years that he actually invokes that argument explicitly, that if our minds are the product of evolution, can they be trusted to resolve these difficult metaphysical and theological questions? Of course, there's another question one might ask, and that is, if our minds are the product of evolution, what transcendental guarantee is there that we could even find truth in science itself? And that's an interesting question, I think, because one of Darwin's mentors here in Cambridge, William Whewell, whom I mentioned last night, was very strongly convinced that progress in science was only possible because the human mind had been structured in a particular way by a divine designer. So that epistemological issue does have resonance with Darwin's early experiences here in Cambridge, his knowledge of Whewell's work. And in fact, if you look at The Origin of Species, you'll find it's a quotation from Whewell that goes right at the front of the book.
John, I wonder if we could just, I know that it might be, the language of dissent is probably familiar to those within this country, but I think the language of dissenting and so on may be quite unfamiliar to those coming from other countries. I wonder if you could fill in a little bit what you mean by dissent, and perhaps reflect on the fact Emma was also a dissenter in her own way, and well, could you just do a little bit of definitions there, because I think some people may not really be familiar with that kind of language. So,
No, I fully appreciate that point, and we are talking here about a very peculiar country in England, where there is an official state church, and if you were not a member of that Anglican church, for example, let's say in the period from Newton through to the period we've been talking about today, you would actually suffer social penalties of one kind or another. For example, you could not take a degree in Oxford or Cambridge if you were not somebody who could subscribe to, could agree with, the official 39 articles of the Church of England. In other words, there was a kind of faith statement, a kind of particular commitment one really had to exhibit if one were to enjoy full social privileges. Now, when you have that situation, of course, you can find politically active thinkers who feel this is all wrong, and particularly if they don't actually agree with the theology of the established church. And so we tend to use the word dissenter to refer to somebody who was not an orthodox member of the English church, but who would nevertheless claim to be a Christian. Indeed, would often claim that they had the true Christianity. It's an issue that I think is quite difficult to articulate, because what one means by dissent in any context, of course, also depends on what you would describe as orthodox in that context. And those contexts shift with time. But I think if you laid outside the Anglican fold, there was always a kind of strong sense of identity. And because certain professions were closed to you, if you were a dissenter, it meant sometimes that a career in science or technology was one of the few viable options for you that might actually give you some kind of mental stimulus. So there is a thesis which says that dissenters, religious dissenters, like Joseph Priestley, were very active in the sciences, more so than Orthodox Anglican clergy, because it was part of their social identity. And if you're looking in England, for example, in the 18th century, for the educational institutions which taught the best science, you would probably not look either to Oxford or to Cambridge, but to the so-called dissenting academies, one of which, perhaps the most famous of which, was up in Lancashire, in Warrington, where Priestley taught for a while. It's only during the 19th century that the disadvantages of being a religious dissenter were very gradually removed through a process of political as well as religious reform. Does that help?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. And also Emma is Unitarian, and Emma is also therefore dissenter. I think that's sort of, she's a devout dissenter. think. That's right.
This is true. There is an issue here which actually harks back to that first question, or the question that we had about whether Darwin's own Christianity was nominal, even in the first instance. But from a social point of view, Emma and Darwin lived a life down in Kent, in Down House, which in its lifestyle was very much that of the village squire and parson. And there have been some very subtle suggestions that even though Darwin, as it were, distanced himself from a career as a priest, he nevertheless retained a certain kind of value system which expressed itself in the kind of life he led as a country gentleman down in the south of England.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, a question there.
I've been around church long enough to come across these sort of fairly apocryphal stories of Darwin's deathbed conversion, which, and I've had many conversations where people have ended by saying, "Oh yes, but he recanted at the end." I understand that's pretty much a myth. However, is there any evidence whatsoever of any sort of change in the end of his life, literally on his deathbed? And do you know where that story came from? Is it just wishful thinking on his detractors?
Well, Jim Moore, to whom I've referred once or twice, one of the Darwin biographers, he's written a book called The Darwin Legend. And I think, rather than my try to answer that question, which is a very complicated one, in fact, you should read that book, because his conclusion, having looked at all the primary sources, is that there is no evidence to support the change of mind. Here in meetings on science and religion, we tend to think that all the big questions are related to science and religion. But in Victorian England, the strongest argument actually used by Christian apologists for the truth of the Christian religion was not the argument from design, but the argument from deathbed repentance. That's actually the argument that gets wheeled out time and time again. So the legend that Darwin himself repented at the 11th hour, as it were, has to be seen against that particular context. There is a particular person who started spreading that story around. It goes back just to a single source. It is very difficult, definitively, to disprove it. That's because it's very difficult, definitively, to disprove almost anything. But there is very little of any merit in that story.